Okay. Well, I think that the first issue, the first question that we have to address is for whom are we making this series of videos, and perhaps a little bit about why.
Okay, I
And,
like that.
maybe the why is the more important question first, because for me, I guess the only way I can explain it is I sense there are two great sentiments that lie in the human breast: justice and liberty. And I knew when I was about 10, 11 years old that I wanted to be a lawyer, because justice is something that has resounded very strongly within me. So I became a lawyer. And when I got to be about 40 years of age, a little bit around there, I had become a fairly successful, by ordinary definitions of that term, trial lawyer. And I started thinking about what I was doing. And I said, you know, this is not what I set out to do when I was about 10 years old. What I'm doing has very little to do with my sentiment of justice. I'm playing a game as a trial lawyer. I'm playing a game. It's like there's a whole bunch of buttons. And if you push the right buttons, you win. And if you push the wrong buttons, you lose. Or if you push more good buttons than the other side, you win. And I said, wait a second. This has got nothing to do with justice. And what happened then is that I realized, by being very honest with myself, that I was losing in the trial process. I was losing a lot of cases that I should have won based on my understanding of justice. And that shook me, because I had devoted, you know, a lot of my time and energy to this. And then I realized also that I was winning a lot of cases I should have lost.
Well,
So,
that's a very significant statement.
oh yeah,
In both cases.
it shook me, Javier, because here I was in my early 40s. As I say, I'd become quite successful. I was playing in the major leagues of Canadian litigation, let's put it that way. I was fortunate. I had a partner with a very good practice. I inherited his practice. I had been to the Supreme Court of Canada half a dozen times. I've been in the court. I had a lot of experience and exposure to the legal system. And I said, this has got nothing to do with justice. So it shook me. And I've spent the rest of my life ever since trying to figure out, why is that? And what can we do to change that? Justice is just too important for me. I was going to say that if I were rewriting anything in the Declaration of Independence, which is a document that I highly, highly respect, I would change the phrase from life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness to life, liberty, and pursuit of justice.
Okay.
And I think I have learned something in the process of examining that, particularly in the process of looking at justice and my experience through the lenses that our mutual friend, the man who inspired both of us, Stafford Beer, gave us to look at the world through. And I began to understand why what I was doing had very little to do with justice, and how we could change the legal system so that justice would be its principal outcome in whichever way.
Well, you see, my story very briefly is that I started studying engineering, and then all of a sudden I realized that I didn't want to do that, and I wanted to study law. And I went and became a lawyer in Mexico. And it wasn't very long after starting to work at the law that I noticed that procedures, as you say, didn't have to do anything with justice. So in the lawyers, one of the lawyers' bars, we tried to change things and we didn't get anywhere in this lawyers association. And then I noticed that I would have to go into politics and change the democratic system in order to have justice. And in a way, after many, many years, we managed to do that in Mexico, and we changed the democratic system to what we have now. And it hasn't been the answer also. So we're back to square one. I'm back to square one, where we can try at least to show young people, professors, or others what our particular experiences with the cybernetic approach, with the systems and cybernetics thinking can do for law, because all during this time we've had this opportunity to enrich ourselves with the ideas from Stafford Beer and his cybernetics, and we both come to the conclusion that this is the way to go. Law has many, many insights into the cybernetics because it's been dealing with information forever. And in many ways, I would say that lawyers have been the earliest of cyberneticians, but lawyers don't know that they are cyberneticians. So if we, that means you and I, make these connections explicit, then I think we would be enriching the lives of the students, the professors studying law, and eventually, of course, and I hope so, we would be influencing the way the tribunals work and the way that justice is done, and we would be perhaps changing the output of the legal system so that all cases that should be won will be won, and those where you shouldn't win, you won't win. Okay? So instead of getting things upside down. So let's start with this. Let's go ahead. And I like your suggestion of the Jeffersonian phrase, pursuing justice. You could say perhaps even happiness and justice at the same time. So this gives an idea of what we're looking at, what we want to do, and I think it's a very interesting challenge that we have here.
Yeah. I guess the first question is, as I'm thinking along with you, is, well, what is justice? And maybe the first question is the most difficult of all, because I don't think anybody has been able to define it so far historically. And there's been many attempts to define justice. And nobody has come up with something that really everybody can sign into or sign on to. And yet, the sentiment, I call it, of justice runs very deeply, I find, with each and every human being I've ever met. And although nobody can really define it and say it's this, it's that, it isn't this, it isn't that, everybody seems to recognize out of any given factual situation, whether the outcome of any conflict or the outcome of any dispute or whatever is just or not. And it may vary with different cultural values, perhaps ethical values, but there isn't that much difference between somebody here in Canada or in Mexico or in India or in China. Or everybody in their hearts knows what justice means to them. And I think most of us have a very similar definition, though it may not be tight enough so that we all can agree yet, you know, that there are rigid edges. This is and this isn't. So I'd say that defining justice, it may be the first task and maybe the most difficult of all. Maybe it isn't necessary to define it. It's just necessary to say to each person who may be listening to us and say, what is justice? It says, don't so much look to me for a definition, but look into your own heart. What does it mean to you? What in your experience is it that makes you feel satisfied that whatever has happened is just?
Well, you see, I would say that we can talk about a definition using our systems approach, our cybernetic way of thinking, and point out to the fact that justice has to be, it must be, the output of a system which is out there and we have to identify. And normally that system would be the justice system, the legal system, the procedural system of law, because our first experience is about our own selves. And when we talk about justice, we are talking about the fact that the state has established rules that say you cannot do justice by your own hand. You have to sort of appeal to the legal system if you want to have justice done. So justice is, in a way, reestablishing some sort of equilibrium in society, because you as a person participates in the society, and the whole assumption is that you let the state do things that you want the state to do so that people don't do justice on their own, by their own hand. And so we have delegated this quest or this procedure to the state. And when we say we want justice, we want the state to act correctly, to do the right thing, to be able to, let's say, look at the facts, to come out with the truth, and to apply consequences to the rules previously established. So doing justice is all of this. It's a big package, and this is what we're looking at, the whole system and the output of all this system. If the system created to settle scores between people works correctly, then we say there's justice is being done. If it doesn't, then injustice has prevailed. So it's our job, and it's been the job of attorneys or jurists all over the world for many centuries now, to try to make the legal system work better. And you only get justice when that works correctly. And this is probably the reason why it is so difficult, because it involves operating this enormous system that needs resources, that has many rules, getting all the time more complicated. But when we're trying to design a system, we always know that there are some assumptions that you use as givens, and then you design the system using those givens, those assumptions, and you go forward. And right now we're living in times where the assumptions made many centuries ago have changed dramatically, because lawyers have been people who have been processing information without having ever stopped to define law as information itself. So I think that besides defining justice, we have to start by redefining law as information, is a very special type of information that is needed first of all, to set up the system and then to make it work. So now that we have a better idea of what information is and how different it is from the material world, and now that we can process information and process huge amounts of information so quickly, the assumptions on which the juridical system was built have changed dramatically. And it will be our job to show why we need a different definition of law, why we need a different definition of justice, why we need a better way of teaching law, what it is. Because if you don't know what it is, and you cannot define it in modern terms, you are going to be using the same assumptions, the same system that's been there for so many years, and that it's clearly not working correctly.
Yeah. I think yes, I agree with you. And I think what's inherent in what you're saying is that lawyers in particular have a certain way of thinking about these things. And that way of thinking is defined or described by the course of history to this point in time, when information was treated or dealt with in a certain way, which has really remained more or less unchanged until the last 50 years or thereabouts, maybe 60 years. And now that we have developed a science that we call cybernetics, it's an opportunity to change, by looking at cybernetics, to change the way we think about these things. And maybe what's required is a quick definition or understanding of what cybernetics is. Listen, cybernetics is very simple. It's not a complex science to describe at all. It is a science of effective organization. How to organize the system effectively so that the inputs that go into a system, the informational input, results after being processed by the system in an output or a result that is just. So the whole science of cybernetics is about what happens inside that system. How is information managed, dealt with, etc., so that the outcome of the process meets the requirements of justice.
I would add that it's also about making sure that whatever output you get from that system, information about what's going on or what went on or what it produced, goes back to the input through the feedback loop to change and adapt whatever is going on inside that black box or that system that we want to operate. So the notion of feedback is a relatively new notion in the world of science. It's been used perhaps intuitively for centuries, but it was only from the mid-40s when cybernetics got itself formalized that feedback became the connection between the mechanical world and the world of living things. And as I said before, lawyers or kings or emperors or people operating the legal system, judges, have this notion of feedback implicit. But now that we know how it works, we can make things much better.
Mm-hmm. I think what we're dealing with here is the old saw. When we're talking about systems and processing, garbage in, garbage out. That's the way that we think. And in terms of garbage in and garbage out, what stands in between garbage in and garbage out is the legal system. And it's the way that the information comes in, the way it's dealt with, it's processed, etc., that determines whether or not what's coming out is garbage or not, is justice or not. And that's really what we're dealing with. It's a new way of understanding how to process that information so that the result is just. There's feedback, there's many other ideas, but it's to understand cybernetics, because what we're talking about, I think what you and I are talking about really is the relationship between cybernetics and justice, and how we can use our understanding of cybernetics to change the quality, meaning of justice in our everyday lives. So though we're using words that sound very philosophical, etc., for my part, I'm talking about something very practical. I mean, you and I can philosophize until the cows come home, but it's not going to help anything. I'm interested in dealing with a situation. When I go into a court and I try a case today, is the result going to be just or is it not? It's got nothing to do with winning or losing. It's got to do with understanding how we think about these things, changing the way we think so that it really develops a different, well, hard to describe, to develop something that satisfies our sentiment that we call justice.
Well, one of the now that you mention this, one of the things that cybernetics can do for law is point out to the fact that when you're exchanging information, people act as filters or they act as amplifiers of this information. And that in the end, we say that justice is the result or the output of the system. And it has to do with finding the proper balance between opposing forces, let's say the opposing parties. Cybernetics would have a great deal of application to this because it tells you that these processes that deal with information act as filters or amplifiers, and you have to know this control equation to know that better lawyers have a better chance of solving the problem, whatever it is, their way, than poor lawyers, than let's say lawyers who are not as competent. And this has to do exactly with the communication capacity of these information channels. We're acting as channels. We're acting as nodes in this communication process, and it's very clear, and it should be very clear, that a more competent lawyer has more resources, more channel capacity to deal with the problem. So you can spend many years in law school and many years of experience to finally realize what it means to acquire this communication capacity. And if you study it through cybernetics, and you would study that in law school when you're in your first year of law, then you would understand things much more quickly, and you would understand that there is obviously no simple and better way to assure that justice is done, except have everybody as informed about everything, including the rules of the process, in a way that you can establish with some degree of certainty that the parties are in this equilibrium and nobody has an advantage over the others. So these are the type of things that can be looked through the glass or through the microscope of cybernetics or through the telescope of cybernetics, And this is the reason why we are making an argument in favor of cybernetics as becoming part of the curricula in universities.
Thinking, yes, yeah, particularly for law students, thinking systemically, because I don't remember, I went to a very good law school here in Canada, and I had an incredible staff of professors, but nobody ever taught about getting it, about justice in any meaningful way, except in terms of, well, whatever the courts have decided over the years, that's justice. So,
well, one of the definitions of law in the Anglo-Saxon system is that law is whatever comes out from the courts. And supposedly, it's a just and fair law that's coming out. And we know that it's very easy to look at the trees without being aware of the forest. And our point is that it's a very good idea to look at the forest and make some, let's say, some reasoning about how the forest works before we even know what kind of trees exist in the forest.
Yeah. Forest and trees is one of my favorite metaphors, Javier. And I always say there are people who can't see the forest because they're so busy looking at the trees. And there are people who are so busy looking at the forest that they don't look at they can't see the trees. And I think
vice versa.
Yeah. And I think perhaps another way of saying what is cybernetics? Cybernetics is a way that shows us how to think of both trees and forests.
So and how they are related.
Exactly. Well, we know, in fact, that trees and forests are one. But because of the way we think, we have forgotten that fact. So people become tree people or forest people, and they forget, hey, wait a second, this is all one. And that's a systemic approach to looking at these things, in particular the law, and looking systemically. That's what cybernetics is all about.
I am aware, and we should say this very clearly, that it's sort of difficult to look at the legal system, the juridical system, the procedural system of law without talking about democracy and government, etc. But we are right now we're taking as a fact that the juridical system, the legal system is there, and that we are going to talk about democracy and the way the rules are made from a government standpoint for later. We are, in this video, more interested in talking about the legal system as far as it is concerned with the justice of doing, there is a function of doing justice.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, when you put justice together with liberty, two subjects, I think that's what the founding fathers were doing in writing the Declaration of Independence, was putting the two together, and that's how they got to democracy. Democracy being what best fulfills that deep sentiment within each of us for justice and for liberty, and therefore a form of government that maximizes those two values, in essence, above anything and everything else.
Yes, and what stands forever are those ideals. We can still search for justice and for maximizing liberty, and we don't have to, the fact that we're talking about cybernetics and systems as tools for our mental images doesn't change that. this is the, let's say, the constant that remains there is the hunger for liberty and the hunger for justice, and those have not been changed by cybernetics or technology, and we're still out to do the same thing as the founding fathers.
And that's a big word that you just used, because it's really what we're talking about. It's technology. How does the evolution of technology change the processes that we have been using historically of achieving justice in any given situation? And technology has changed everything in our worlds, particularly over the last 100 years. As Einstein said, it's changed everything except the way we think. And that's the reason we have such a mess, because technology has changed the world and we're seeing it every day. But in terms of the way we think about justice, and when we look at the judicial process, nothing has changed, though technology has changed everything else. So
well,
now
we have a system that is has built its walls around itself to protect itself. It's not only the system, but it's also the legal profession and the way the incentives and the motivations are set up. And we know that complex systems, such as the one we're talking about, tend to develop their antibodies, their own protection schemes, and they are being reinforced. And there will be many lawyers in the future that, as in the past, will say, this is the way the system works, and it feeds a lot of people, and this is the way it should work, and we don't want to talk about change. We think that it works fine as it is. We have the adversarial system, and supposedly that's going to take care of justice. And as you said in the beginning, you practice law where you win cases you should have won, and you lose cases you should have won. So I've convinced myself through the years that any case whatsoever can be decided in one way or the exact opposite. Why? Because the system of justice is this system taking inputs from two parties, processing those inputs, and then churning them out an output with some solution, where if you are guided by certain principles which are valid, you come to one result. If you are deciding through other principles, you come to a very different and perhaps opposite result. And that is something that is intrinsic to the difficulty of dealing with justice and dealing with laws and the legal system.
But that in itself is one of the issues that we really want to talk about, because the system, the process, is built on a win-lose mentality. And I mean, we've learned a lot about win-lose mentality and win-win. But every case, well, let me restate that. Every situation involving a relationship between two parties can be looked at not through a win-lose, right-wrong lens, but through a balancing of the interests of both parties, so that the result is a process of accommodating those interests with our sensing of what is just and reaching a result that is just to both sides. Win-lose seldom is just to both sides. The winner always thinks justice has triumphed because the winner won, and the loser thinks the exact opposite. But there's a way of reconciling those by thinking systemically and by trying to that people usually use the word balance, but you're right. The right word to use here is equilibrium, to equilibrate the interests of both sides, so that the result is a blending of the two, not necessarily a win-lose proposition where you either go one way or the other. And that win-lose mentality, notwithstanding all the changes that have taken place over the past 25 years or so in relation to what we call alternative dispute resolution, the processes are still fixed on this win-lose mentality. And that's one of the things that has to change.
But at the same time, Boris, I think that if one of the parties went into a contract on bad faith and he's trying to extract an agreement where he gets a benefit that was not clearly stated, and then he uses the legal system to try to get what was never intended that he should get. When we talk about balance and doing justice, it doesn't mean that the guilty party should get like half of what he wants just because he went into bad faith and managed to entangle his counterpart. It means that what we're trying to reach is a system which can detect the bad faith with which one of the parties went into the contract and then give him nothing, assuming that is the fair result. Because mediation should not mean, okay, let's split the problem in two and let's give half of what everybody asks, because one of the parties can really be entitled to nothing. It's not just about mediating. Mediating means, to me, having both parties coming to a process where they must give the authority much more information than the legal system would admit, and then solving the problem according to that store of information, where lawyers are no longer maneuvering or no longer trying to outmaneuver their opponents. So we would have to be very careful to make sure that what we want to define as justice is to produce a system of law which will come and provide the best possible solution, taking into consideration all the information that is relevant, and then deciding on what it was that exactly that people were entitled to in that contract or in that relationship.
Yeah, you use the word mediation. There's two words here that I think are very important in terms of what you and I are talking about. Mediation comes from the Latin mediare, which means to be in the middle. And most mediation, like the legal process, winds up in a supposedly the objective is in any event to wind up in a proposition where both sides give, and the win-lose proposition is balanced by meeting in the middle. You know, it's the old idea. I offer you $10, you ask for 20, we meet in the middle and take 15. And that's what is called alternative dispute resolution. I like to distinguish that from conciliation. Conciliation comes from the Latin conciliare, which means to bring together. And what I'm really saying ultimately is that in the legal process, we try to split the differences between the parties. And what I think leads to justice is really bringing both parties into a process where, for all the rights, wrongs, good reasons, bad reasons, etc., but where they both benefit equally from the situation that they're in. It's a way of finding a process of bringing them together, and for all their differences and for all their disputes and for all their conflicts, they both benefit from the result. To me, that is conciliation. For me, is much more consistent with my sensing of what justice means than is mediation, where you're using a process of compromising until you reach a compromise where you meet in the middle, or sometimes it's not always in the middle. But yes, it's a different way of looking at conflicts.
But it shouldn't mean that a party that goes in bad faith into an arrangement, knowing that he has trapped his counterpart, is using the system to get something that he wouldn't have gotten if things had been said correctly from the beginning. So nobody can benefit from his own bad faith. That's what I mean. And the justice system should not be a system that ignores people going in bad faith into an arrangement. Okay, it should be such a system that it's wise enough to detect when somebody went into a contract on bad faith and then is going to use the legal system to get half of something he was not entitled to at all, you know. And we've seen enormous lawsuits where eventually there's this, as I say, decisions that come out that you say, well, this doesn't look right. This doesn't seem very appropriate. And yet there's nothing we can do about it because the legal system, the justice system is made with rules, and those rules are not very, let's say, up-to-date according to the way of thinking that cybernetics, as you said, the science of effective organization brings to us and makes available to us.
So maybe really to sum up or summarize what we're talking about is we're talking really about a different way of thinking in the judicial process, a different way of thinking in the sense that it's more comprehensive than the way the process works now, in that it takes into account the situation in a larger context rather than the very narrow specific facts that which we deal with. Oh boy, that's not being said very well at all. I know what I want to say, but it's not coming out very well at all. I don't know.
Give it another try.
I think bottom line is what we have to do is we have to change the way we think about conflict resolution in the judicial process. We have to think of fairness in terms of what we now understand about.
I could say a little bit differently perhaps, and come to the idea that we want to convey, is that the legal system has evolved through the ages, centuries, okay, by sort of trial and error in adopting the rules that seem fit and discarding rules that do not seem fit, okay? And now we have a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, which is cybernetics, which is fully developed, that can look at many of the problems that had to be approached and solved and decided upon in order to make the legal system work. And if we know these principles, if we know these laws of cybernetics, we know about information processing, and it's a lot that we know now, then we could look at the system that was designed through trial and error and say, well, we can understand why this rule was adopted, but we now know that it produces this other result that's been ignored. And this is why we have a legal system that can do many funny things, things that are not intended. So this is what I think cybernetics and systems thinking has to offer to the legal profession.
Mm-hmm. So you were saying that, I was thinking that one of the problems with the legal system, the legal process, the judicial process, is that it's too Newtonian. You know, we think that in adjusting the rights of people, that it's like a game of billiards in a billiard table. If you hit the ball a certain way, then it's going to trigger off all sorts of logical consequences, etc. And, you know, it's all very mechanistic. If you push this button, it's going to go this way and that way, and that's going to resolve the problem. And what we have learned from cybernetics in particular is that perception, that way of thinking, is really not very helpful, or it's not very accurate. Newton, for all his brilliance, that was a different time, a different system, a different level of understanding of these things. And what science has changed is our way of looking at situations. What cybernetics has changed is a way of dealing with what we see in a different way. It's not a Newtonian world at all when it comes to law, and it shouldn't be, because the first victim of that Newtonian approach of, you know, clockwork mechanisms, the law works like a clock or like a billiard table. The first victim of that process is justice. The process eats up justice, and usually or frequently, and if you look at the decisions of the courts, at least in the democratic and democracies around the world, of course, every nation claims to be a democracy. But if you look at the processes of justice in each land, they each have their own clock and their own mechanism, but it's all the same. And the result, as I say, the first victim is justice. You know, it's what strikes me as what drives me in what we're doing is a realization that I came to not that long ago, that there's not a single person on the face of this planet who lives in a just society. I dare anybody to stand up and say, oh no, I live in a just society. It doesn't exist. And cybernetics, systems thinking, is what gives us an opportunity to look again and say, okay, what we have been doing for the past many centuries is limited by what we knew then about information and the science on the process of dealing with and processing information.
That's a very good way to put it.
And since now we have much better understanding of how that works, it says, okay, now we can address these systems from a different perspective.
Absolutely.
It's a systems perspective that helps us to balance many more
variables
in the equation.
That's correct. Well, with that being said, I think we can stop for now and give ourselves a chance to look at what we've said and see if it makes sense, and then give it another try.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop this right now, and until next time.